Hey, welcome back to Jack's Apocalypse. Tonight's story is about a guy who planned everything: food, water, a hidden shelter deep underground where no one could find him. He had it all figured out, and then four men showed up, and one of them was already tuned. Hit like if you're in, subscribe so don't miss the next one story, and let's begin.
My name is Aaron Pike. I am 37 years old, and I teach geology at a community college in Kamloops, British Columbia. Before the outbreak, I spent my weekends underground. I had been caving as a hobby for 15 years, and the cave system above the Thompson River Plateau was mine in the way that a place you have mapped and named and slept in becomes yours. I drove into those hills 3 days into what the province was still calling a public health emergency. I sealed myself below the surface. This is what it cost me to do that. I need to tell you what I saw on the highway before I left, because that is where the decision came from. It was the 3rd of November. I had been following the news at the college since the first reports came out of the lower mainland 2 weeks earlier, and each day the language on the television got plainer, and the anchors started looking like people who had stopped sleeping. I was teaching my Thursday morning lecture on limestone karst formation to a class of 16 when my phone buzzed with a provincial emergency alert. I read it, put the phone in my pocket, and finished the lecture. 3 students had already left before I reached the end. I do not know what happened to them. I drove home and started loading the truck. 2 headlamps with spare batteries in a sealed case. A 60-meter climbing rope. 2 butane lanterns with 6 extra cartridges. A camping stove, 3 weeks of freeze-dried rations, a full first aid kit with antibiotics from a former student who was now a doctor, a water filter pump, and 3 liters of chemical treatment as backup, the hand-crank emergency radio, a bolt-action Remington 700 in .308 Winchester with 240 rounds. I also had the handcart, collapsible, 90-kilogram rated, rubber wheels, purchased 3 years earlier for hauling sample equipment. I had taken it into the cave twice before on mapping trips, and I knew it would come apart at the axle pin if I needed it to fit through the squeeze passage. The hatchet was an old one, hardwood handle wrapped in electrical tape where the grain had dried and cracked, the head reground by me once. I packed it last, in the cab beside the rifle, where I could reach both without climbing into the bed. I left before dawn on the 4th of November. Highway 1 was already a problem before I reached the Cache Creek Junction. The eastbound lanes were moving slowly. The westbound lanes, heading toward Vancouver, had stopped entirely. I passed a furniture van with its rear doors hanging open and the cargo gone. I passed 3 vehicles nose to tail in the ditch on the right shoulder. Not an accident exactly, just stopped, as if someone had parked there and walked away. The people I could see through windshields were not moving. I pulled a U-turn at the junction and took the back road north. I stopped for fuel at a crossroads station, about 35 kilometers out of Kamloops. The lot had maybe 25 vehicles, most of them sitting quiet, a few people outside talking or watching the road with their hands in their pockets. A man in a heavy canvas jacket, with a lever-action rifle slung on his back, came over while I was at the pump. He told me the road through Merritt was blocked south of town, that he had heard on his CB that the RCMP was setting up controlled access points at the major intersections, and that he was planning to go north until the roads told him otherwise. He smelled of cigarettes and wood smoke. He did not ask where I was going. I thanked him, and he walked away. Inside the station, a young woman sat behind the counter on a stool watching the door. In the far corner near the motor oil rack, a man in a grey jacket was moving in a slow, undirected way and making a sound with his breathing that carried from 10 meters away. The woman behind the counter looked at me. I paid cash for the fuel already pumped and left without speaking. I drove north for another hour and a half on roads that narrowed from asphalt to gravel to a dirt 2-track through second-growth timber I had not visited in 4 years. I had the route written in a field notebook in the glove box. I stopped twice to move fallen branches. The second time I stopped, I heard something in the trees off to my right. Not a bird, not a deer stepping on wood. I stood at the open truck door for 2 minutes and listened to it without being able to identify it. Then I got back in and drove. It may have been a deer. I did not go back to check. The sinkhole entrance is in a limestone ridge, running roughly northeast to southwest above the old logging operations. I found it 14 years ago while doing fieldwork for a regional geology paper on interior karst formations. The opening is 4 meters across at the rim, surrounded by deadfall and low scrub that makes it invisible from any path that does not lead directly to it. Below the rim is a 6-meter vertical drop into what I named Chamber 1 in my survey notes. Chamber 1 is oval, about 12 meters at its widest, with a floor of mixed mud and flat limestone breakdown. 3 passages branch from it. The left passage climbs steeply and ends in a mud crawl after about 20 meters, with no useful exit. The right passage drops quickly and within 10 meters becomes fully submerged, only accessible in dry season with diving equipment. The center passage is the one that goes anywhere. The center passage runs for about 40 meters on a slight downward grade, past 2 low points where water pools in wet weather, and then reaches the squeeze. The squeeze is a horizontal slot in a section of denser limestone, 60 centimeters high and 90 centimeters wide. You go through face up, arms forward, and it takes about 4 minutes if you know the technique. With a loaded pack, it is not possible. Every item has to come through separately, pushed ahead or pulled behind. Beyond the squeeze, the passage opens into the gallery. I named it that because 3 flowstone formations run from floor to ceiling along the south wall, each one a different shape and color, deposits that took 10,000 years to form. The gallery is 8 meters wide, 11 meters long, and 3 meters high at the center. The floor is dry dust and old breakdown limestone, flat enough to sleep on without rolling. No standing water. Temperature holds at 8 degrees Celsius year-round. There is a natural vent in the ceiling at the far end, a crack in the limestone that connects to the surface somewhere above. I had tested it on a previous trip with a candle. The flame bent toward the crack. Air was moving out. I had been in the gallery 6 times in 14 years on recreational mapping visits. I had eaten lunch in it, slept in it once, taken measurements in it dozens of times. I had also sat in it with my headlamp off, just to understand what complete darkness actually is. Most people have not been in a place with no light source of any kind. It is different from a dark room. A dark room has ambient light coming under doors and around curtains. The gallery has nothing. You can sit in it with your eyes open or closed, and the result is the same. I parked the truck a kilometer from the sinkhole in a shallow ravine off the 2-track and covered it with a tarp weighted down with stones. Then I started carrying loads. The approach to the sinkhole is a 1/4 kilometer of uneven ground through scrub and fallen timber. The handcart was useless on this terrain. I carried everything by hand, 2 trips with a pack, and several more with individual loads roped to my shoulder. It took most of 2 hours to move everything to the rim. I had placed a fixed bolt in the limestone beside the sinkhole rim 4 years earlier during a solo mapping trip. The bolt held. I threaded the 60-meter rope through it, dropped the free end into the shaft, and rappelled in with the first load. Chamber 1 received me with its usual smell, cold mineral water and old mud, the smell of stone that has not seen sun in a long time. I piled the load at the base of the center passage and went back up. 6 loads total down the shaft, with the harness friction hot on my hands by the 4th. By the time everything was at the Chamber 1 floor, the light outside the sinkhole was orange and low. Then the squeeze. I laid everything out on the Chamber 1 floor and began pushing items through the slot, one at a time. Loose items first: batteries, lantern cartridges, freeze-dried food packets, the first aid kit, the ammunition tins, the radio, then the collapsed sections of the handcart, which came through side-on with resistance at the axle housing, then the rolled sleeping bags, then the plastic sheeting folded tight into a rectangular bundle, then the 2 main packs, deflated and flattened as much as possible, then the coils of rope, the hatchet, the folding saw, the rifle last, wrapped in a cotton shirt and slid through ahead of me while I was flat on my back in the slot, arms leading. working through on my back with the stone ceiling a hand-width from my chest. I came through into the gallery after dark, by headlamp. My elbows were scraped, and my lower back registered the crawl work. I sat on the gallery floor for a few minutes and looked at the pile of gear and listened to the cave. Caves have a sound, not silence. Water movement somewhere in the lower system, irregular, stopping and starting, rock settling. Small pressure change clicks in the passages that come and go without cause. I had slept underground before, and I knew these sounds, and they did not concern me. What I was listening for was anything that did not belong to the category of cave sounds, and there was nothing in that category. The gallery was empty, except for me. I set up the sleeping area first. Largest piece of plastic sheeting on the floor, edges overlapping to cover about 3 meters by 2, foam pad on top of the sheeting. One sleeping bag laid flat as a base, the second laid on top for warmth. The temperature was 8 degrees, and with both bags and the right layers, it was manageable. I had done colder. The camping stove went on a flat breakdown slab near the far end of the gallery, directly below the ceiling vent. I ran a test before using it. Stove on for 45 minutes, candle on the floor, away from any movement. The candle flame bent consistently toward the vent. Exhaust was clearing. Adequate for cooking if I kept sessions under 30 minutes. I rigged a clothesline between 2 rock projections on the north wall using a short length of cord. I arranged the food stores in one section of the gallery. Freeze-dried bags in one pile, organized by type. Hardtack and rice in sealed waterproof bags in a second pile. 8 cans of various foods I had limited myself to because of weight. The ammunition went in the sealed case under the sleeping area, accessible but not exposed. The rifle leaned against the wall near the head of the sleeping bag. I set both lanterns at opposite ends of the gallery and turned them on. The light was warm and even, and sufficient to read by. The shadows in the flowstone formations on the south wall shifted as I moved, which I noted and filed as an expectation rather than a reaction. I had seen it before. I knew what it was. I did not light the stove that first night. I ate cold from a freeze-dried bag mixed with cold water from my bottle. It rehydrated poorly and tasted of salt and nothing much. I ate every bit of it. I was hungry, and it was food, and that was the end of the analysis. In the morning I went back up through the squeeze, through chamber 1, and climbed the rope to the surface. The air outside was cold enough that my breath showed. The frost was heavy on the deadfall and the scrub. Nothing moved on the ridge in any direction I could see. I had the hand-crank radio with me. At the sinkhole rim, with clear sky above, I got reception on the provincial emergency broadcast frequency. The announcer was reading evacuation routes for the Thompson-Okanagan region. He listed which corridors were open and which to avoid. He told listeners not to approach anyone showing signs of disorientation or aggressive behavior following illness. He used the words infected and contagious. He did not say what the illness was or how it transmitted. He sounded like a man reading from a script that someone else had prepared, and like a man who had read it enough times that he was no longer thinking about the words. I spent 20 minutes at the surface. Then I pulled the rope up after me, coiled it, and dropped it back down into the shaft. I wanted it underground with me. A rope visible at the rim of a sinkhole is a rope that tells someone the sinkhole is occupied. I climbed down using the fixed holds in the shaft wall instead, which was slower but workable and left nothing to see at the surface. I set the first snares that afternoon. 4-wire snares, standard loop sets for rabbits and hare, placed on the runs I had noted on the south side of the ridge, above the sinkhole. Snowshoe hare tracks in 3 places. Fresh, rabbit tracks in 1. I set the loops at the right height and at the entry points of the runs, and I moved away without disturbing the ground around each set. I also established a flat rock at the north edge of the sinkhole rim as my daily radio position. I went there each morning at 7. The broadcasts shortened through the first week. By the 7th morning, the broadcast was 9 minutes, and repeating the same phrases in the same order, and I was not certain anyone was producing it live. The snares produced on the 3rd day. A large snowshoe hare, caught clean. I brought it underground and cleaned it at the edge of chamber 1, away from the gallery, and cooked it that evening. The stove ran for 22 minutes. The gallery smelled of cooked meat for the next 12 hours. I wrote in my field notebook, "Vent clears exhaust, does not clear food smell." This is a problem I had not planned for. In the second half of the first week, I built 2 more snare sets higher up the ridge and found a small spring about 300 meters east of the sinkhole, still running cold and clear under a mossy ledge. I marked it on my field sketch. By the end of the first week, the gallery was organized well enough to use without rearranging things daily. Snares checked every second morning, cooking on alternating evenings, surface radio check at 7. I had books and a deck of cards, and the cave itself, which required its own form of attention. Not comfortable, manageable. On the 9th day, I found the prints. I was coming back from the eastern snare set along the return route I had established when I saw them in the frost-crusted mud between 2 stands of scrub spruce, about 15 meters from the sinkhole rim. 2 sets of work boot prints, heavy lug tread, adult male size, at least size 11. They had come in from the east, circled the sinkhole at a radius of about 3 meters, and gone back east the way they had come. The frost had set the edges of the prints. They were at least 10 hours old, likely from the previous afternoon. I stood at the edge of the print pattern for a minute, without approaching it. East meant the old logging road. The road was visible from the ridge in dry months, but in November, with the deciduous scrub still holding most of its cover, a person on that road would not easily see the sinkhole area. They would have had to be looking, or following something. The cook vent smell, maybe. I had been cooking. I had been up here every morning. I had been here for 9 days. I reset the snares and went back underground. I did not change anything immediately. Reacting to boot prints that might belong to someone passing through was less rational than waiting for more information about what the prints meant. I told myself this was a reasoned assessment rather than avoidance. 4 days later, the leaves I had scattered over the ground around the sinkhole rim were disturbed. 4 sets of prints this time. They had come closer, to within a meter of the rim edge. 1 set was smaller, size 9 or 10. Whoever the smaller print belonged to had stood at the rim and looked down for long enough to move their feet twice while standing there. I checked the rope coil in chamber 1. It was where I had left it, behind the arrangement of breakdown pieces I had stacked near the center passage entrance to make the passage look like it ended there. I checked the squeeze for marks or disturbance. Nothing. The stacked pieces had not been touched. I began going to the surface only in mid-morning windows rather than at dawn, timing my surface checks to allow me a clear view of the eastern approach from the ridge before I came out over the sinkhole. I pulled 2 snare sets on the east side of the ridge, the side facing the direction the prints were coming from. I kept the 2 western sets running. I moved the rope coil deeper into the center passage, behind the squeeze, so that even if someone came down the shaft and found chamber 1, they would see 3 dead-end passages and leave. I also moved a portion of my food stores to a second cache in the gallery, behind the breakdown pile at the far end. Not everything. Enough. I worked at night by headlamp, quietly. On the 14th day underground, I was in the gallery cooking the second snowshoe hare of the week when I heard sounds in chamber 1. Not footsteps. The sound of a person moving in a space they do not know, touching the walls, stopping, changing direction. Then a voice, low and male, and a second voice answering from farther back. The sounds of more than one person navigating the center passage toward the squeeze. I turned off the nearer lantern, moved to the far end of the gallery, and crouched behind the breakdown pile with the hatchet in my right hand. I left the second lantern on its lowest setting, positioned pointing away from the squeeze entrance. The rifle was 2 meters to my right against the wall. I left it there. Gunfire in the gallery was not a choice I was going to make unless I had absolutely no other option. A headlamp appeared at the squeeze entrance. The person wearing it came through face up, which is the correct technique. That meant he had either been in tight passages before or had found the right position by experimenting in chamber 1. He stood up on the gallery side and turned his headlamp around the space. He was large, mid-40s, heavy through the chest and shoulders, wearing a Carhartt jacket and a wool hat. His beard had not been trimmed in at least 3 weeks. He found my lantern with his beam and then found me a moment later. He put both hands up part way, not a full raised hands gesture, just an acknowledgement that he saw the hatchet and was not advancing. He said, calmly, that they had seen the cook vent above the sinkhole and followed the smell. I said how many? He said 4. He said his name was Doug Fetter. He told me he had been foreman on a mine access road project contracted through a company out of Barriere, British Columbia. The project had shut down in October when the crew could no longer get supply vehicles in, and when the roads south became impassable for the mine company's fleet. He and his 3 remaining crew members had been stuck at the project site, about 3 kilometers east of here. They had a camp there with some project supplies remaining. They had been managing since October. When they saw the smoke from my vent, they had followed it over 3 days before finding the sinkhole. The second man came through the squeeze while Doug was talking. Younger, maybe 26, taller than me and lean, with a split lip that had scabbed but not fully healed. He stood up and looked at the gallery, and his eyes went to the food pile, the lanterns, the sleeping area, in a sequence that was too organized to be casual. He stopped looking when he noticed me watching him look. I told Doug the other 2 stayed in chamber 1. He turned back to the squeeze and called through in a short phrase. A voice answered, flat. He turned back to me. I told him no one was to come closer to the gallery than the squeeze entrance without asking me first. He accepted this without any visible reaction. We talked for about an hour, across the gallery with the lantern between us. Doug organized his words in the way a man does when he has been thinking about what he is going to say for several days. He told me what he had at the camp: canned food, diesel fuel, several large hand tools, a generator. He told me what he was offering: 4 men who could do physical work, and what he described as security. He said in exchange he wanted access to the deeper parts of the cave, which he believed were more defensible than the surface camp. I asked what he meant by security. He said, 4 of us, 1 of you. He said it simply and left it there. I told him I would give an answer by noon the following day. He went back through the squeeze, and I sat in the gallery alone and thought about it for a long time. I had 3 options. I could refuse, which would leave 4 men who knew the location of the only descent rope with no reason to cooperate with me. I could accept without conditions, which would bring 4 people whose behavior I had not assessed into a space I had designed and supplied for one. Or I could accept on terms strict enough that I kept what I needed, while giving them enough that they had real reason to stay cooperative. I chose the 3rd option, and I had the terms written in the field notebook before I went to sleep. The gallery remained my space. They stayed in chamber 1. During daylight hours, they could come through the squeeze for cooking and for discussions. But at night, the squeeze passage was my side only. All food was pooled and rationed by me based on my inventory count. Supply decisions were mine. Decisions about external movement and surface timing were mine. Noise discipline in the cave was mine to set and enforce. I went back to the squeeze at noon and told Doug the terms. He listened to all of them and accepted without arguing a single one. He accepted them quickly and completely, and then asked when his crew could move their gear in from the camp. A man who needs something will accept conditions too easily when he first hears them. I knew this. I noted it and moved on. The 4 men came through the sinkhole that afternoon, 1 at a time, with their packs. Warren Bosch was first after Doug, a 38-year-old equipment operator with a quiet, methodical way of moving in a space. The kind of person who reads a room by how it functions rather than how it looks. He assessed my rigging at the sinkhole without commenting on it and immediately began improving the haul anchor without being asked. By the end of the afternoon, the descent was faster and the haul system was better than what I had built alone. He did not say anything about it when he was done. He just moved on to the next thing. Richie Kane came through next. 26, thin, keeping his left arm close to his body and his left forearm turned inward against his abdomen when he was not actively using it. When he put his pack down in chamber 1, he used his right arm only. I asked him about the arm, and he said he had taken a knock from a piece of equipment and bruised the shoulder. He said it with a level face and did not add anything. I registered it and kept watching. Pete Strang was last. 44, once athletic, and now carrying extra weight on top of it, with small, precise eyes in a wide face that were always measuring something. He came through the gallery on that first afternoon and looked at every item I had with a thoroughness that was not casual and was not accidental. I knew the look. It was the look of a man doing inventory on something he plans to use later. He was the project safety officer, Doug had said, which on a road grading crew meant he managed first aid and did paperwork. In a cave, the title did not mean anything, but the eyes did. That first evening I cooked for 6. Freeze-dried beef and rice with boiled filtered water from the cave stream. Not good food. Adequate food. Everyone ate. Doug thanked me. Warren cleaned his own bowl and set it aside. Pete ate his full portion without comment and then looked at the food pile again, as if calculating the meal into a larger number. Richie ate about half his portion, said nothing, and went back to Chamber 1. Warren found me at the snare sets on the second morning after the crew arrived. He came up through the sinkhole on his own, which I had not explicitly prohibited, and found me at the eastern set, where the hair runs were most active. He said he had something to tell me. He said Richie had been bitten on the left forearm 2 weeks before they had reached the cave. He had told Doug at the time that it was a feral dog, at a camp they had stopped at on the road north. Warren had seen the wound dressing 5 days ago at the project camp when Richie was changing it and thought he was alone. It was not a dog bite. The shape of it was wrong. The depth was wrong. Warren said this plainly, without hesitation, and then moved to the next snare set and reset the wire. He had said what he came to say. He was not looking for a response. I asked him why he was telling me now and not earlier. He said Richie had been running a fever since the previous night. I went back to the gallery that morning and moved the rifle from its position against the wall to behind the breakdown pile at the far end, where the secondary food stores were. I told myself this was sensible positioning. I was not wrong about that. It was also something else. I told Doug about it that evening. I found him in Chamber 1 and told him what Warren had said, directly, without softening it. Doug listened, with no change in his expression. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he told me he already knew. He had seen the wound when Richie changed his dressing 3 days ago. He said it with the flat certainty of a man who has already processed the information and decided what it means for his decisions. I told him we needed to address it now, while Richie was still cooperative. Doug said Richie was one of his guys. He said right now Richie was holding together. He said he would handle it. He said it the way a foreman says something is not up for further discussion. Then he turned and went back to the far side of Chamber 1, where his gear was set up. I went back through the squeeze and spent the rest of that evening reading and not reading. Over the 4 days that followed, the shape of the crew in the cave became clearer in the way things become clear when you stop hoping they will arrange themselves differently. Warren was straightforward and useful. He reinforced the windbreak over the sinkhole rim from scavenged deadfall. He found a secondary water source closer to the sinkhole than the spring I had marked on my field sketch. He repaired a section of plastic sheeting that had torn in the squeeze. He did these things without reporting them or asking for acknowledgement. He was the kind of person who makes a space work better the longer he is in it. Doug managed the Chamber 1 space efficiently, kept the crew's equipment organized, enforced the noise rules consistently, and did not make any direct demands of me after the first negotiation. But he was always watching my supply arrangement, and he was always positioned between the squeeze passage and the chamber when he was not sleeping. Not blocking the passage, just present near it. Pete Strang did very little. He claimed a bad knee made the rope work at the sinkhole shaft impossible. This may have been true. He spent most of his time at the entrance of the squeeze passage, sitting or half leaning against the wall, in a spot that was technically Chamber 1, but was within a few meters of the gallery entrance. He ate full portions at every meal. He watched. He talked to Doug in low voices at intervals, and from the gallery, I could hear the register of those conversations without the words. Two men who had agreed on something going over the details of it. Richie stopped coming to meals on the fourth day after the crew arrived. Doug brought food to him in Chamber 1 and came back without saying anything about what he had seen. On the sixth day, I could hear Richie from the gallery at night. Not loud, not steady, just the sounds of someone in ongoing discomfort who is managing it by trying not to make noise, shifting weight, irregular breathing. Occasionally a sound that stopped before it became a word. On the fourth night of that stretch, lying in the gallery by the lower lantern light, I heard Pete Strang's voice from the squeeze passage. He was not talking to me. He was talking toward Doug somewhere in Chamber 1. Low and consistent, the tone of two men going through a plan they have already agreed on in principle. I heard the shape of it without the words. I turned off the lantern and lay still for 90 minutes. Nothing came through the squeeze. In the morning, I repositioned the rifle so I could reach it from the sleeping bag in under 3 seconds. Doug came to the squeeze on the morning of the 7th day and called my name. His voice was controlled, not urgent. I came to the squeeze entrance on the gallery side with the hatchet on my belt. He told me Richie had a high fever and had stopped responding clearly to questions since the previous evening. He told me it was time to decide what to do. He said it the way a man says something when he believes he is already ahead in the decision. I told him the decision was straightforward. Richie needed to leave the cave. Not Chamber 1, the cave entirely. Above the sinkhole perimeter and away from the entrance. If Doug wanted to go with him and see to him above ground, that was his choice to make. But Richie was not staying in the cave system. Doug said, quiet and flat, that I would put a sick man outside in November. I told him I would put a man with a bite wound and 2 weeks of incubation time and a rising fever outside in November. Yes, today if possible. Doug held my eyes for a long time. He said, very quietly, whether I understood what I was asking him to do to one of his own men. I said yes. I said if he did not handle it, then I would seal the squeeze from my side with the breakdown pieces I had positioned for that purpose, and his crew would have no further access to the gallery or to the food stores in it. I said I had a secondary exit that they did not know about, and I would use it rather than share the cave under those terms. I was not certain I would do all of that. I was certain I would do most of it. Doug turned and went back into Chamber 1 without a word. I moved to the gallery wall and stood with my back against it and listened. For about 20 minutes, Chamber 1 was quiet. Then I heard Richie's voice for the first time in 4 days, elevated and not forming complete sentences. Then Doug's voice, lower, repeating something. Then Pete Strang cutting across both of them with something short and definite. Then a sound like something being dragged across a stone floor. Then a pause of about 30 seconds. Then sounds that did not come from any of those 3 men. I had the rifle in my hands before I made a decision to pick it. Up, I was at the gallery end of the squeeze passage, crouched, with the lantern behind me, watching the squeeze entrance and listening. I recognized the sounds from Chamber 1. From the base of the sinkhole shaft, where the acoustics gathered and amplified, came the sounds I had first heard at the Crossroads gas station, at the stopped trucker against the wall. The sounds a person makes when the management of sound is no longer something they are doing. Not animal sounds, exactly. Something in the middle distance between the two. Without edges, without purpose behind them. The sinkhole shaft above Chamber 1 works like a vertical horn, 6 meters of smooth limestone, carrying everything that happens at the base, directly upward, and then reflecting it back down louder, and with a slight delay, so that the same sound arrives twice, layered over itself. I had noted this acoustic effect in my survey book years ago as an interesting property of the chamber geometry. I was not thinking about it as interesting now. Pete Strang's voice went very high for 1 second, and then stopped. Then Chamber 1 became a different kind of loud. Not voices, impact sounds. Bodies and objects against stone walls in a space 12 meters across, confined enough that there was no distance between any collision and the next. I could feel it through the gallery floor, through 30 meters of passage, and 2 low points and the squeeze. vibration in the limestone, conducted perfectly. This went on for 4 minutes and 20 seconds by my watch. Then the impact sounds changed quality and gradually slowed. The other sound, the one from Richie, was still present and it was moving. I could track it by its volume. It was coming toward the center passage. I moved back behind the breakdown pile and checked the rifle. 3 rounds remaining. I had loaded a fresh magazine 2 days ago, the full 5 rounds. I had removed one on a surface check when I thought I might need it. The math was simple and not good. Something entered the center passage, moving slowly, moving wrong. The correct technique for the passage is a half-crouched walk with one hand on the right wall. What I could hear in the squeeze approach was a different kind of movement. No technique, just pressure against the walls and the floor, advancing without thought about what was in the way. Then behind it, a second sound, moving faster, using the correct technique. A headlamp came through the squeeze first. Warren Bosch came through face up, correctly, and stood in the gallery with a long tear in the right shoulder of his jacket and a cut along the left cheekbone, bleeding into the collar of his shirt. He was breathing through his open mouth and looking at me with the rifle pointed past him at the squeeze entrance. He said, "Richie was gone. Pete was gone. Doug was behind him." I said, "Where is Doug?" Warren turned and looked at the squeeze. He said, "Right behind me." From the squeeze passage I heard the other sound, the one that had been moving through the center passage. And then I heard Doug Fetter's voice, one short word, cut off in the middle of it. Warren turned back to me. He said, "Seal it." The 3 breakdown pieces were where I had placed them over 2 weeks earlier, 2 meters from the squeeze entrance on the gallery side. I had moved them there at night, quietly, while the crew slept in chamber 1. Warren looked at them and moved to the nearest one, without waiting for instruction. 2 men lifting a slab that I could not have moved alone, 2 sides of irregular limestone moving as fast as its weight allowed. 30 seconds for the first piece. The second piece had a high center of gravity, and we tipped it on the first attempt. We repositioned and moved it correctly on the second attempt. The third piece, the heaviest, we slid on a length of plastic sheeting laid on the gallery dust, dragging it into the gap between the first 2 and wedging it in place with a section of broken limestone under the leading edge. We stepped back. The barricade was not airtight. I could see through 2 gaps. But the combined weight of the 3 pieces was substantial, and the squeeze slot was largely blocked. Nothing was coming through it quickly. Nothing was coming through it without making significant noise over an extended period. We stood and listened. After a short pause, something began working against the left wall of the squeeze slot. Not testing the way a person tests a space, just applying continuous pressure, working forward without stopping when it met resistance, without adjusting technique. The sound was slow and constant, and it did not stop. Warren had the spear. He had picked it up from the gallery wall without my noticing, and was holding it centered in both hands, not raised for a strike, just in position. I raised the rifle. The first shot in an enclosed limestone chamber is a physical event. The pressure wave hit my ears and my chest at the same time, and my hearing went to a sustained, high-pitched ring immediately. Not ringing exactly. A tone, sustained, covering everything else. I worked the bolt by feel. I could see what was in front of the barricade. I could see that the first shot had done what it needed to do. The second shot was not well aimed. My concentration fractured for 1 second between the ring and the muzzle rise, and the shot went into the ceiling at a shallow angle. A plate of limestone, 60 centimeters across and about 20 centimeters thick, separated from the ceiling at the impact point and fell. It struck the top of the barricade, bounced off the larger block, and fell into the squeeze opening above the gap between the first 2 blocks. It sat there at an angle, wedged against both walls of the squeeze slot, covering the upper portion of the gap. I had not aimed for the ceiling. It was a mistake. The ceiling plate was now blocking the squeeze from above, in a way the breakdown blocks did not achieve on their own. The gap was narrower, the upper opening covered. The combined weight of the breakdown barricade and the fallen ceiling plate together, something that would require hours of sustained effort from the other side to shift. I stood in the gallery, with the rifle at my side, and the ring in, both ears so total that I could not separate individual sounds. Powder smoke and limestone dust in the air. I watched the barricade gap for 2 minutes. Nothing moved through it. Warren sat down on the gallery floor. He sat heavily, the way a person sits when the legs make the decision. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked at the barricade, and then at me. He said something. I could not hear it above the ring. He said it again, and I read the shape of his mouth well enough to understand it. The low room. I said yes. 2 days earlier, I had told Warren about the back connection and the low room, not as a plan, but as survey information. I had shown him the section of my field notebook where I had mapped the lower passages, the chimney above the low room that connected to a surface exit, and the north wall crack where the underground stream entered. I had told him about the sump at the south end of the low room that connected to the flooded right passage in Chamber 1. He had listened and said nothing at the time. He had filed it. I told him the reasoning quickly now. Widen the crack enough to increase stream flow. The low room fills faster than the sump can drain. The pressure backs up through the sump into the right passage. The right passage carries water into Chamber 1. The water level in Chamber 1 rises until the squeeze approach is submerged. Anyone in Chamber 1 who was still present at that point would be below water. He said, how long would the crack work take? I told him the limestone around the crack was soft interior range material with a clay seam running. Along the fissure edge, susceptible to mechanical widening with the right tool. I estimated an hour, possibly 2. I told him I would be standing in rising cold water for most of it, and my hands would be a problem if I went past 90 minutes. Warren said he would watch the barricade. He said go. I took the hatchet, 2 spare headlamp batteries, the rope coil, and the rifle slung on my back. I went to the far end of the gallery and shifted the flat cover stone off the back connection entrance. The connection is 15 meters of belly crawl, narrower than the main squeeze but straight and without the 90-degree turn. I pushed the rifle and rope ahead and came through into the low room feet first and stood up. The low room had 12 centimeters of standing water across its entire floor. Cold. The kind of cold that concentrated in the feet and worked upward. The ceiling sloped down at the south end to about 1.5 meters where the sump began. Smooth water surface above the submerged passage to Chamber 1. The headlamp showed the north wall clearly. The crack ran vertically from the floor to 1.5 meters, widest at chest height, where it reached about 4 centimeters. The water entering through it was a continuous seep with a mineral smell. The limestone on both sides of the crack was the pale yellow-white material that forms in the interior ranges where calcium carbonate deposits around clay inclusions, softer than the grey limestone in the upper passages. I had noted the clay seam in my survey book 3 years ago as an interesting structural feature. I was thinking about it differently now. I started on the left side of the crack, using the hatchet as a wedge and a hammer alternately, working into the clay seam where it ran parallel to the crack face. The rock came away in fragments at first, then in larger sections as I got into the wet clay behind the face. Each section that came away increased the water entering through the crack by a small amount. After about 20 minutes, the floor water was at 16 centimeters. After 40 minutes, it was at my mid-shin. I worked lower, toward the base of the crack, where the seam was thickest and wettest. This section came away more easily. The clay so saturated it separated from the limestone face in solid pieces when I worked the hatchet into it at the right angle. My hands were losing temperature steadily. I stopped twice and worked them against each other hard for 30 seconds to bring function back. At what I estimated was 50 minutes, the water was above my knee and rising. The crack was now open to 7 or 8 centimeters at its widest, and the flow had changed from a seep to something that made a sound. The low room would fill completely, given enough time. The sump surface was still smooth, not yet pressurized to backflow, but the rate of rise told me it was coming. Then from the back connection, Warren's voice, one short word. And behind it, from the gallery, a heavy sound. Not small. I went through the back connection as fast as I could manage, which was not fast. 15 meters on my elbows with cold water soaking into my clothes at the crawl entrance. I came out into the gallery on my hands and knees and stood up. The barricade had shifted. The two smaller breakdown pieces had moved about 40 centimeters from their original positions under sustained pressure from the squeeze side. The ceiling plate was still wedged in the upper gap, but one of the lower gaps had opened enough that I could see the passage beyond it clearly. Warren was at the center of the gallery. He had used the spear. I looked at the gap in the barricade. I looked at what was still working through it. I raised the rifle. The shot was in the passage, not the gallery, through the gap. The pressure wave in the gallery was less than the first round had been, the gap absorbing some of it, but my ears were already running on the sustained ring from before, and this added to it. I worked the bolt, 1 round remaining. The ceiling above the barricade did not come down again, but the pressure wave had shifted the larger breakdown block about 15 centimeters toward the squeeze, and the ceiling plate had dropped another 10 centimeters into the gap, tightening the opening from the top. The net result was a smaller gap, lower and narrower, partially obscured by the shifted blocks. Nothing was moving through it now. Warren said something. My hearing was mostly the sustained ring at that point. He pointed at the barricade gap. I watched it. For 4 minutes. Nothing. The sounds from Chamber 1 were present, but distant. The water acoustics had changed in Chamber 1. Not the same air column resonance as before. Heavier. I checked the back connection entrance from the gallery side. Nothing coming from that direction. Nothing from the low room. The water level in the low room was rising toward the back connection entrance, which meant the low room was filling faster than the sump was draining. Warren and I moved everything essential to the far end of the gallery. My pack, the remaining food stores, the first aid kit, ammunition, the field notebook. We did it without discussing it, moving the same items by the same logic. Then we sat at the far end of the gallery and watched the barricade for the rest of that night. Nothing came through the gap. By morning, 3 days after the low room work, the gallery was quiet. The squeeze passage acoustic had changed character. In normal conditions, the passage carried small sounds from Chamber 1 with clarity. The new acoustic was flat and heavy, the acoustic of a passage that was full of water at its Chamber 1 end. The squeeze approach had flooded from below. Warren and I checked the back connection in those first days. The low room was flooded to the ceiling. The sump at the south end was backed up. Chamber 1 was flooded below the squeeze level. The secondary exit chimney, accessible from the upper passage before the flood line, was still clear to the surface. Warren confirmed this on the second day. Going up on a rope I anchored in the upper passage. We did not use it immediately. The temperature outside dropped below -20 in December and held there through most of January. The secondary exit emerged at a higher elevation than the sinkhole and more exposed to wind. The gallery was cold but stable. We had food for longer if we were careful. We chose the gallery. I have thought about how to describe those 4 months underground in a way that is accurate and not longer than it needs to be. It was a long winter, and it was a hard winter, and it was also, in some sections, ordinary in the way that any extended routine becomes ordinary. The days had a shape. The food was monotonous. The cave was cold. The work of maintaining the snare sets and managing the fuel supply and tracking the food stores gave the day's structure. The books gave the evening's structure. Warren gave the silence's structure, which is not a contradiction. Warren Bosch was good company, not warm company exactly, but consistent and honest in the specific way that is worth more than warmth in a cave in winter. He had opinions when they were needed, and no opinions when they were not. He grew up in a town of 800 in northern Ontario, where winter was something you organized your life around rather than survived. He told me this when I asked him how he was managing the cold better than I was in January. He did not say it as a point in his favor, just as information. He told me about Deborah once, his ex-wife, in Kelowna when the outbreak started. He looked at the gallery ceiling when he said it, in the even way that a person looks at something far away when they are deciding not to look at what is close. He said it once. He did not return to it. I did not ask him about it again. I developed a chest cough in January. It lasted 3 weeks. I treated it with the antibiotics in the first aid kit and rested more than the routine required. and drank heated water from the cave stream through the filter. It responded to the treatment slowly. My hands cracked in the cave air, and 2 cracks on the right thumb became infected. I treated them with antiseptic from the kit and dressed them daily. They cleared in 10 days. Food was the chronic difficulty. The freeze-dried stores held through January on careful portions. By February, I had cut portions twice. The snares were inconsistent through the coldest weeks. Then in mid-February, a warm stretch brought a snowshoe hare movement through the ridge, and the sets produced 4 animals in 8 days. We ate well for those 8 days and dried what could not be eaten immediately. We had books and a deck of cards, and the routine that came from having work to do in the hours between sleeping. Warren was better at cribbage than me, and did not pretend otherwise. We played for long stretches in the evenings, and it served its purpose. I did not record anything about what happened in Chamber 1. I was aware I was making that choice. I made it deliberately. The field notebook was a working document, and Chamber 1 was not something I needed in a working document. I thought about Doug Fetter often through those months. Not sharply. More the way you carry a weight that has been there long enough that you have organized your posture around it without noticing. I had been right that Richie was a danger, and that the situation would force itself. What I had not managed was giving Doug enough real ownership of the problem to make him use it responsibly. I had treated him as a variable to account for, rather than a person who needed real stakes in a shared outcome. I kept returning to this not out of guilt exactly, but out of the structural dissatisfaction of seeing where the reasoning broke down. Warren said, one evening when I was working through some of this out loud, that Richie was going to go regardless. He said the question was whether it happened in the cave or outside it. He said probably the only thing I could have changed was the timing. He said probably. He left the probably in there. That honesty was worth more to me than the reassurance would have been. In early March, Warren went up the secondary chimney on a rope I anchored at the base, and came back down and said the surface was clear. No smoke on any horizon. The logging road below the outcrop was empty. The air smelled of melt. The ground was soft. The birch trees on the south-facing slopes were showing the first pale yellow-green at the branch tips. We spent another week in the gallery preparing the exit packs. We reorganized everything by weight and necessity. Remaining food first. 8 days' worth if we rationed well. The water filter. The first aid kit. As restocked as possible. The emergency radio, which had received only static since November, but was worth the wait. The field notebook. The rifle, and 116 rounds in the padded case. The hatchet. Warren lashed the spear alongside his pack without my commenting on it. I did not comment on it. We went up the chimney in the second week of March. I went first, rifle slung, and pulled the packs up on the rope after I reached the top of the chimney passage. Warren came last, free climbing the lower section and taking the rope for the upper 12 meters. He came through the fissure, opening onto the limestone outcrop, and stood up and looked at the hills. The sky was overcast, pale, a few degrees above freezing. The logging road ran northeast through the valley below us, empty as far as either of us could see, no movement anywhere. The only sounds were wind and a runoff creek in the timber below the outcrop, ice breaking up somewhere lower in the drainage. I had been underground for approximately 120 days. Coming out into open country under a pale, overcast sky with hills in 3 directions was an amount of space that required a few minutes to absorb. We walked northeast along the logging road. Warren had the spear. I had the rifle slung. We did not talk much for the first hour. The mud was heavy underfoot, the road surface broken by frost heave and runoff, and we walked carefully. I was weaker than I expected to be. 4 months of shortened rations and limited movement had taken more than I had tracked in the notebook. We heard nothing human for the first 6 kilometers. Then, around a bend where the logging road met a wider valley road, we saw smoke from a stovepipe about 3 kilometers ahead. At about 9 kilometers from the secondary exit, we came around a bend and found the settlement. A cluster of a dozen buildings on the south slope of the valley, residential and commercial, with a feed store visible by its hand-painted sign and a garage with the doors open and tools laid out on a workbench inside. A generator was running somewhere behind the feed store building. People came out of the garage when they saw us. 4 of them, stopping at the edge of the building, watching. Neither group moved for a moment. Then a woman walked toward us from the group, measured pace, not hurried, not retreating, hands visible. Her name was Sylvia Dern, 63 years old, had run the feed store for 22 years. Grey hair cut short, canvas barn coat, rubber boots with dried mud to the ankle. She asked where we had come from without any preamble. We told her. The limestone cave system above the ridge to the southwest, roughly 120 days underground, secondary exit to the northeast logging road. She listened without expression and asked 2 follow-up questions. Which road had we used coming in, and what had we seen on the road south? We answered both. She told us what she knew. 11 people in the settlement, organized since mid-October, a CB radio network running on the provincial emergency frequency with intermittent contact to other communities, food stores in good condition, a perimeter maintained in overlapping shifts, rules established by consensus in the first weeks and enforced consistently since. The infected were still active in the lower valleys and some rural areas, but the pattern of their movement was becoming more predictable. Communications between organized communities were operating, thin but functioning. Supply exchanges had begun on some routes. She said we could stay if we worked and followed the settlement's rules. She said the rules were available in writing if we wanted to read them before deciding. Warren said he was staying without waiting to read them. I said I needed until morning. Sylvia said morning was fine and showed us to a room in the residential building. She brought us food that evening. Canned tomatoes over pasta with dried herbs and reconstituted milk powder in coffee. It was warm, and there was a full portion of it, and it was the best meal I had eaten in 4 months. I ate every part of it. Warren was asleep on his side of the room before the lantern was cold. I walked out to the tree line at the edge of the settlement that evening, not far, 200 meters to where the valley slope began to climb toward the ridge. I stood there in the cold and looked up at the hills in the direction of the cave system, which I could not see from here because the timber was too thick and the evening light was falling. I had spent 120 days below those hills. I had planned the shelter, prepared it, stocked it, mapped it, and lived in it. The geology had done what the survey said it would do. The water had followed the gradient I knew it would follow. The crack had opened when the clay seam gave way. The low room had filled. The sump had backed up. The chamber had flooded. The passage had sealed. Every physical system in the cave had behaved correctly. I had been right about all of it. What I had not modeled well was people arriving with their own histories and their own calculations and their own points past which negotiation was no longer useful. I had treated the cave as a system I could control through knowledge of its structure. That was true for the rock. It was not true for the men who came into it. I had known this in the abstract. I had taught geology for 12 years, and geology is, at its core, the study of systems that do not respond to what the observer expects of them. I had the academic version of this knowledge. I had not had the other kind until November. I thought about Doug Fetter for a long time standing at the tree line, not with the sharp edge of it, more the way you carry a weight that has been there long enough that you have stopped noticing you are carrying it and have just organized your posture around it. He had not been a bad man, in Warren's assessment, and Warren was not given to charitable assessments. Warren Bosch was the one who told me about the bite when it mattered. Warren was the one who helped me move the breakdown pieces when the barricade needed to be sealed in under a minute. Warren was the one who watched the barricade gap while I was working in cold water in the low room. I had not wanted Warren in the gallery. I had managed him as a variable. He had been, in the event, the difference between surviving and not surviving, and not because of any single dramatic action, but because he was consistently honest and consistently useful, and did not stop being either of those things when things became difficult. I had gone underground to be alone. I had worked at making that nearly true. The cost of nearly was 4 people, including one who had helped me most, who very nearly did not come out either. I went back to the settlement before the cold got into me properly. I found the room, and lay down and slept. I told Sylvia in the morning that I would stay. She told me Warren had already been in the garage since 6:30 and had a portable diesel generator disassembled on the pole workbench. She told me there was a section of north perimeter fence that needed additional posts before the next cold weather came back in, and that the post driver was in the corner of the garage next to the lumber stack. I went to the garage. Warren had the generator's fuel system components laid out on a clean cloth in the order he had removed them, which told me this was not his first time doing this work. He looked up when I came in and looked back at the generator. He said, "Hand me that wrench." I handed him the wrench. He said the post driver was in the corner if I wanted to start on the north fence. I found the post driver and went to the north fence line. It was below freezing still in the mornings, the ground hard under a surface layer of soft mud. I worked the post driver for 2 hours in the cold and the flat, pale spring light, working down the fence line from the northwest corner toward the tree line. The valley was open on 3 sides from where I was working, clear country with the hills visible in the southwest, the ridge that I knew the inside of in the way you know a place you have spent 4 months in the dark with. From here it looked the same as every other ridge, a line of trees against a grey sky. I drove the last post of that first day's section into the ground at about noon and stood up and looked at the fence line running back to the corner. Level, well spaced. The work was straightforward, and it was done, and it had taken most of a morning. This is the kind of work that matters when you are rebuilding something, not the large decisions, the fence posts. I did not go back to the cave. There was nothing in it that I needed. The gallery is still there, 8 degrees and dry and silent, with the flowstone formations on the south wall and the field notebook in the breakdown pile with the secondary supply cache. If someone finds it in 50 years, the notebook will tell them the water table elevation in November, the hair production rates at the East Ridge snare sets, the load capacity of a 90-kilogram handcart on a 40-meter passage with 2 low points, the useful facts. It will not tell them everything that happened in there. That is what I have just told you. My name is Aaron Pike. I was underground for 4 months, and I came out in spring. I came out thinner and partially deaf from rifle shots in an enclosed space and with a scar on my right thumb. I came out with the specific knowledge that knowing a place and controlling it are not the same thing, and that isolation as a survival strategy works until the moment it does not. And at that moment, you need something other than isolation. The cave is still there. The gallery is still dry. The squeeze is still exactly 60 centimeters high. Chamber 1 is flooded and has been flooded since November, and everything that was in it when the water came in is still in it. The sinkhole is still open at the surface. With the rope gone from the shaft, the 6-meter drop is a one-way trip for anyone who does not know what they are walking into. I mapped that cave. I know every passage and every water source and every place where the rock is soft and where it holds. I know the gallery better than most rooms I have lived in. I am not going back. And that's where we'll stop for now. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell me how the story hit you, what moments worked, what didn't, and what you'd want to hear next. And a big thank you to everyone supporting the channel. You keep this project alive. Until next time, Survivor. Jack's Nightmares, signing off.